Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the military base's shooting range, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the standard-issue rifle. At 19 years old, he was the youngest recruit in Delta Company, and everyone made sure he never forgot it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert terrain, and the older soldiers gathered in small groups, smoking cigarettes and exchanging stories from their previous deployments. Marcus kept his distance, knowing that earning their respect would take more than just showing up. His journey to this moment had been anything but conventional. Growing up in a small town in Montana, Marcus had spent his childhood helping his grandfather on their ranch. The old man, a veteran himself, had taught Marcus how to handle a rifle before he could even ride a bike properly. Those early morning hunts in the mountains, tracking elk through thick forest and waiting patiently for the perfect moment, had shaped Marcus into someone who understood the value of patience and precision. His grandfather always said that shooting wasn't just about pulling a trigger. It was about reading the wind, understanding your breathing, and becoming one with the weapon in your hands. When Marcus enlisted, his recruiter had been skeptical. The kid looked more like a high school student than a soldier. With his lean frame and boyish face that made him appear even younger than his actual age, during basic training, the physical challenges had pushed Marcus to his limits. He struggled with the obstacle courses, barely meeting the minimum requirements for the endurance runs, and often finished last in the hand-to-hand combat drills. The drill sergeants seemed convinced he wouldn't make it past the first month. But everything changed when they reached the shooting qualification rounds. Marcus approached the firing line with the same calm focus his grandfather had instilled in him years ago. While other recruits tensed up, squeezing their triggers with jerky movements and scattered accuracy, Marcus settled into a natural rhythm. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied, and the noise of the range seemed to fade into nothing. Shot after shot found its mark with an inconsistency that caught everyone's attention. The range instructor, a grizzled sergeant with 20 years of experience, stopped his usual patrol behind the firing line and watched Marcus complete his qualification with a perfect score. That performance earned Marcus a ticket to advanced marksmanship training. But it also painted a target on his back. The other soldiers in his unit saw him as the kid who got lucky, someone who needed to prove himself beyond the controlled environment of a qualification range. They weren't cruel about it, but the distance was there. During meals in the mess hall, conversations would quiet when Marcus approached. On field exercises, he often found himself paired with the least desirable duties, cleaning equipment while others handled more important tasks. Sergeant First Class Robert Hayes, the unit's senior sniper, had been watching Marcus from the beginning. Hayes was a legend in the regiment, a man who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, with more confirmed eliminations than anyone wanted to count. He rarely spoke unless necessary, and when he did, everyone listened. Hayes had a way of seeing through people, understanding their strengths and weaknesses with just a glance. He noticed how Marcus moved on the range, the way the young soldier's entire demeanor changed when he held a rifle. It reminded Hayes of himself many years ago, one afternoon. As Marcus was cleaning his weapon in the armory, Hayes appeared beside him without a sound. The sudden presence of the legendary sniper made Marcus jump slightly, nearly dropping the cleaning rod he was holding. Hayes didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite as cold as his reputation suggested. He picked up Marcus's rifle, examining it with the careful attention of someone who understood that a weapon was more than just a tool. The barrel was spotless, the action smooth, every part maintained with obvious care and respect. Hayes asked Marcus where he learned to shoot. The question was simple, but coming from someone like Hayes, it carried weight. Marcus explained about his grandfather, about the Montana mountains and the long hours spent learning patience and precision. He talked about how shooting had never felt like violence to him, but rather like a conversation between the shooter and the target. A moment of perfect understanding when everything aligned. Hayes listened without interruption, and when Marcus finished, the sergeant simply nodded and walked away without another word. The next morning, Marcus found his name on a list he never expected to see. He was being transferred to the unit's designated marksman program, a specialized training course that only the most promising shooters were invited to join. The news spread through the barracks quickly, and the reaction was mixed. Some soldiers congratulated him, seeing it as a well-deserved opportunity. Others muttered about favoritism and luck, convinced that Marcus would wash out within the first week. The pressure was immense, but Marcus felt something else too. For the first time since joining the military, he felt like he might actually belong somewhere. The designated marksman course was brutal in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. It demanded mental discipline that pushed students to their absolute limits. 12-hour days began before sunrise and often extended well past midnight. Students learned advanced ballistics, understanding how bullets behaved at extreme distances, how temperature and humidity affected trajectories, and how to calculate adjustments for wind speed at different altitudes. They studied camouflage and concealment, learning to become invisible in any terrain. They practiced holding positions for hours without movement, ignoring pain and discomfort until their bodies learned to simply exist in stillness. Marcus threw himself into the training with desperate determination. While other students complained about the workload or cut corners during solo practice sessions, Marcus stayed on the range long after official training ended. He memorized ballistic tables until he could calculate adjustments in his sleep. He practiced breath control until his heartbeat could slow on command. His body might have been the weakest in the class, but his mind and his will were becoming something extraordinary. The instructors noticed, and slowly, grudgingly, they began to see Marcus as more than just the youngest kid in the program. The training course lasted 8 weeks, and each week brought new challenges that seemed designed to break the students down. Marcus watched as classmates who had seemed far more qualified than him began to drop out one by one. Some couldn't handle the mental pressure of constant evaluation. Others struggled with the isolation that came with sniper training. The reality that their future role would often mean operating alone or in small teams, separated from the main unit. Marcus understood that isolation already. He had been alone since the day he arrived at the base, so this new solitude felt almost comfortable. During the 5th week, the instructors introduced long-range shooting scenarios that pushed everyone to their limits. The targets were set at distances that seemed impossible, small silhouettes barely visible through the scope, even with perfect conditions. Wind flags dotted the range, showing the shifting air currents that could throw a bullet off course by several feet. The instructors explained the assignment with clinical precision. Each student would have 3 attempts to hit a target at 800 meters, a distance where every tiny mistake would be magnified into complete failure. Marcus watched as student after student failed to connect. The top performers in the class, soldiers who had been shooting competitively since childhood, missed repeatedly. The instructors showed no emotion, simply marking down the failures and calling the next name. The pressure in the air was thick enough to choke on. When Marcus's turn came, he walked to the firing line, feeling the weight of every eye on his back. This was the moment that would define whether he truly belonged in this program, or if his earlier successes had been nothing more than lucky coincidence. He settled into position behind the rifle. Feeling the familiar weight of the weapon against his shoulder, through the scope, the target looked impossibly small, a dark shape shimmering in the heat waves rising from the desert floor. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, pushing away the thoughts of failure and doubt. He remembered his grandfather's voice, calm and steady, telling him that the target didn't matter. What mattered was the shooter becoming part of the shot, trusting in the preparation and the thousands of hours of practice that had brought him to this moment. His first shot missed by inches, the impact visible in the dirt just to the left of the target. The instructor said nothing, but Marcus could feel their disappointment. He made a small adjustment, compensating for the wind that had shifted slightly since his first attempt. The second shot was closer, but still no impact on the target itself. He had one chance left, and failure here would mean starting the entire week of training over again. Some students never recovered from that setback, the mental defeat proving too much to overcome. Marcus took a deep breath and let it out slowly, allowing his heart rate to drop. He made another tiny adjustment to his scope, trusting his instincts more than the calculations. The world narrowed to just him and the target, everything else fading into meaningless background noise. His finger found the trigger, applying pressure with the gentleness of someone handling something precious and fragile. The rifle cracked, the recoil familiar and expected. And through the scope, Marcus saw the target spin as the bullet struck dead center. The range fell silent for just a moment, before one of the instructors confirmed the hit. It wasn't celebration exactly, more like acknowledgement that Marcus had done what was required. But for Marcus, it felt like a massive weight lifting from his shoulders. He had proven to himself that he could perform under pressure, that his skills weren't limited to controlled qualification ranges. As he stood and moved away from the firing line, he caught Sergeant Hayes watching from a distance, the older man's face showing nothing but his eyes, holding something that might have been approval. The remaining weeks of training passed in a blur of exhaustion and incremental improvement. Marcus learned to estimate distances without equipment, to read terrain like a book, and to think 3 steps ahead of every situation. The instructors taught them that being a marksman wasn't about being the toughest or the strongest. It was about being smart, patient, and willing to take the shot when it mattered most. They hammered home the responsibility that came with the role, the understanding that their actions would have consequences that rippled far beyond a single trigger pull. When graduation day arrived, Marcus stood with the 7 other students who had made it through the complete course. Out of the original class of 23, only 8 remained. The graduation ceremony was simple and private. No families invited, no photographers capturing the moment. The instructors shook each graduate's hand and presented them with their designated marksman qualification, a small badge that represented months of brutal training and sacrifice. Marcus felt pride, but also a strange sense of nervousness. The training was over, but the real test was just beginning. His return to Delta Company was different from his initial arrival. The soldiers who had dismissed him before now treated him with cautious respect. They had heard about his performance in the marksman course, stories filtering through the base grapevine with the exaggeration that always accompanied military tales. Marcus tried to downplay his achievements, not wanting to seem arrogant or above his unit, but the dynamic had shifted whether he liked it or not. He was no longer just the youngest kid in the company. He was a specialist with skills that could prove critical in combat situations. Sergeant Hayes began including Marcus in sniper team training exercises, pairing him with more experienced operators who could teach him the practical aspects of their trade. These sessions were different from the formal instruction of the course. They were raw and honest, filled with stories of actual combat situations and the difficult decisions that came with them. The veteran snipers didn't sugarcoat the reality of their work. They talked about the weight of taking a life, even an enemy combatant, and how that weight never truly went away. They spoke about the mistakes they had made and the brothers they had lost because of split-second decisions that could never be taken back. Marcus listened and absorbed everything, understanding that these men were offering him something precious. They were sharing their experience so that he might avoid their mistakes, giving him the unwritten knowledge that couldn't be taught in any formal course. He learned about the importance of a good spotter, how the partnership between shooter and observer was built on absolute trust. He discovered that patience wasn't just waiting for the right shot, but having the discipline to not take a shot when conditions weren't perfect, even under pressure from commanding officers who didn't understand the complexities of long-range engagement. During field exercises, Marcus began to find his place within the team dynamic. His role was specific and crucial. It's providing precision fire support that could eliminate high-value targets or threats that conventional rifles couldn't reach. He learned to work in coordination with infantry units, understanding how his actions could create opportunities for the larger force or protect vulnerable elements during operations. The other soldiers started to see him as an asset rather than a liability, someone whose presence made them safer and more effective. But beneath the growing confidence and acceptance, Marcus carried a quiet awareness that all of this training was building towards something real. Eventually, Delta Company would deploy to an active combat zone, and when that happened, everything he had learned would be tested under conditions where failure meant lives lost. The thought kept him up at night sometimes, lying in his bunk and wondering if he would be ready when that moment came. If his skills would hold up when the targets were shooting back and the stakes were measured in blood, rather than scores on a qualification sheet. The deployment order came 6 months after Marcus completed his marksman training. Delta Company was being sent to a contested region where insurgent forces had been gaining ground, threatening supply routes and attacking coalition positions with increasing boldness. The briefings painted a picture of a challenging environment with mountainous terrain that favored defenders and made conventional operations difficult. For the sniper teams, it represented exactly the kind of situation where their skills would be most valuable and most tested. Marcus spent the days before deployment preparing his equipment with obsessive attention to detail. Every piece of gear was checked and rechecked, every backup system verified, every potential failure point addressed. He wrote a letter to his grandfather, trying to put into words what this opportunity meant to him, how the old man's patient teachings had led to this moment. The letter was difficult to write, filled with things Marcus wanted to say but couldn't quite express, gratitude mixed with fear and determination. He sealed it and left it with the company clerk to be sent, along with dozens of other letters from soldiers saying goodbye to the people they loved. The flight to the forward operating base took nearly 20 hours, broken up by refueling stops at military installations across 2 continents. Marcus sat squeezed between other soldiers, trying to sleep in the uncomfortable webbed seats of the transport plane but finding rest impossible. Some soldiers played cards or read books, trying to distract themselves from thoughts of what waited ahead. Others sat in silence, lost in their own mental preparations. Sergeant Hayes sat nearby, his eyes closed but clearly not sleeping, his face showing the calm that came from having done this many times before. They arrived at the forward operating base in the middle of the night, the landscape visible only as dark shapes against a slightly less dark sky. The base was a collection of concrete barriers, sandbag fortifications, and temporary structures that looked like they could be packed up and moved at a moment's notice. Soldiers who had been there for months moved through the darkness with practiced ease, navigating by memory rather than sight. The air smelled of diesel fuel, dust, and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify. A scent that he would later recognize as the smell of a place where violence was always close. The first 2 weeks passed in a blur of acclimatization and preparation. Marcus learned the specific challenges of operating in this environment, where temperatures swung from scorching heat during the day to bitter cold at night. The altitude affected bullet trajectories in ways he had to adjust for, and the rocky terrain made finding stable shooting positions a constant challenge. The enemy was cunning and experienced, having fought in these mountains for generations. They knew every cave, every ridge, every position that offered tactical advantage. Delta Company's mission was to secure a vital supply route that ran through a mountain pass, a narrow road that was the only viable path for vehicles moving supplies to forward positions. Insurgent forces had been hitting convoys regularly, using the high ground to their advantage and disappearing into the mountains before reinforcements could arrive. The brass wanted the sniper teams to turn the tables, to make the enemy feel hunted instead of being the hunters. It was a mission that played to Marcus's strengths, but the pressure was immense. Sergeant Hayes assembled the sniper teams for a mission, briefing that was unlike anything from training. Real intelligence reports showed enemy movement patterns, probable observation posts, and areas where attacks had been most frequent. The plan was for 2-man sniper teams to occupy positions overlooking the supply route, remaining hidden for days if necessary, waiting for the enemy to reveal themselves. Hayes would lead one team, and to everyone's surprise, he selected Marcus to lead the other. The room fell quiet when the announcement was made. Everyone understanding the weight of that decision, Marcus felt a mixture of pride and terror at being given such responsibility. Leading a team meant more than just taking the shot. It meant making decisions that could affect the entire mission, keeping his spotter safe, and living with the consequences of every choice. His spotter would be Corporal James Peterson, a veteran with 2 previous deployments, who was known for his sharp eyes and calm demeanor under pressure. Peterson was 10 years older than Marcus, and giving him orders felt strange and uncomfortable at first. But Peterson showed no resentment, only professional focus on the mission ahead. They inserted into their position under cover of darkness,
now moving slowly through rocky terrain,
with full packs weighing them down. Every step had to be careful and silent, avoiding loose stones that might clatter and give away their presence. The position they selected was a shallow depression in the rocks, about 1,200 meters from the road, offering a clear view of a section where previous attacks had occurred. It wasn't comfortable, barely enough space for 2 men to lie prone, but it provided concealment and a good field of fire. For the first 36 hours, nothing happened. Marcus and Peterson took turns on watch, one always alert while the other rested. Though true rest was impossible in such conditions, they ate cold rations, moved only when absolutely necessary, and communicated in whispers that barely qualified as sound. The monotony was broken only by the occasional convoy passing below, supply trucks grinding through the gears as they climbed the mountain road. Unaware of the protection being provided from the rocks above, on the second night, Peterson spotted movement on a ridge across the valley. Through their night vision equipment, they could see figures moving with purpose, carrying what appeared to be weapons. Marcus studied them through his scope, counting at least 8 individuals taking positions that overlooked the road. They were setting up for an ambush, probably planning to hit the morning convoy that intelligence had reported would be moving through. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but Marcus felt his heart rate spike as reality set in. These weren't paper targets on a range. These were people, and in a few hours, he would have to make decisions that would end lives. Peterson placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, silent reminder that they had trained for this moment. Marcus nodded, forcing himself to breathe slowly and think through the tactical situation. The enemy position was at extreme range, nearly 1,500 meters across the valley and uphill. It was a shot that would challenge every skill Marcus possessed. Environmental conditions would be critical. Wind speeds at different elevations between their position and the target. The temperature gradient as the sun rose, even the rotation of the earth over such a distance. One mistaken calculation, and the bullet would miss by meters. They spent the remaining hours of darkness preparing. Peterson calculated distances and angles while Marcus studied the wind patterns. Watching how dust moved on the distant ridge and estimating air currents they couldn't directly measure. They discussed scenarios and backup plans, what they would do if they missed, how they would extract if their position was compromised. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with shades of orange and pink, Marcus settled behind his rifle and began his final preparations. The convoy would arrive soon, and with it, the moment that would define everything he had worked toward. Through his scope, Marcus could see the enemy fighters more clearly now in the growing light. They were young men, probably not much older than Marcus himself, preparing their weapons and watching the road below with the confidence of people who had done this successfully many times before. They had no idea that someone was watching them, that their ambush had been detected, that their lives were now measured in the time it would take for a convoy to appear on that distant road. Marcus pushed away thoughts about who they might be, what circumstances had brought them to this mountain, what families might be waiting for them to return. This was war, and sentiment was a luxury that could get his own people killed. The sound of diesel engines echoed through the valley before the convoy came into view. A line of supply trucks making their way up the winding mountain road. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, feel the sweat on his palms despite the cool morning air. Peterson lay beside him, ranging the target one final time and confirming the calculations they had worked through during the night. 1,520 meters to the enemy position. Wind from the west at approximately 8 miles per hour at their elevation, but stronger in the valley between them. Temperature rising as the sun climbed higher, which would affect air density and therefore bullet trajectory. Through the scope, Marcus watched the enemy fighters prepare to spring their ambush. They had rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons positioned to rake the convoy from above. The lead truck would take the first hit, blocking the narrow road and trapping the rest of the vehicles in the kill zone. It was a well-planned ambush that would likely succeed if not interrupted. The lives of the soldiers in those trucks depended entirely on what happened in the next few minutes. A responsibility that felt heavier than any physical weight Marcus had ever carried. Peterson's voice was barely a whisper as he confirmed wind conditions one more time. Marcus made a final adjustment to his scope, compensating for the upward angle and the distance that would make even the most perfect shot a challenge. His finger rested lightly on the trigger, applying no pressure yet, just feeling the cold metal and remembering his training. Every instructor who had taught him, every hour spent on ranges, every bit of knowledge his grandfather had shared, all of it came down to this single moment. The enemy fighters tensed as the convoy drew closer, raising their weapons and preparing to fire. Marcus picked his target, the man who appeared to be the leader, the one giving hand signals to the others. Taking out the leader first might cause confusion, giving the convoy precious seconds to react and take cover. Through the scope, Marcus could see the man's face clearly, despite the distance. See the determination in his expression. The way he gripped his weapon with practiced familiarity. Marcus took a breath and let it out slowly, his heart rate dropping as his body entered the state of calm focus that had become second nature through countless hours of practice. The world narrowed until nothing existed except the target, the rifle, and the invisible line connecting them across 1,500 meters of mountain air. His finger increased pressure on the trigger steadily, no jerking motion, just smooth inevitability. The rifle cracked, the sound echoing across the valley. And even as the recoil pushed against his shoulder, Marcus was already watching through the scope for impact. The bullet took just over 2 seconds to cross the distance. And in that time, Marcus felt like he could count every heartbeat. Then the target dropped, the shot hitting exactly where Marcus had aimed. The other enemy fighters froze for just a moment, confused about where the shot had come from, and that hesitation was fatal. Peterson was already calling corrections for the next target while Marcus worked the bolt, chambering another round with practiced speed. The second shot followed within seconds, then a third, each one finding its mark as the enemy position dissolved into chaos. Some of the insurgents tried to return fire, but they were shooting blindly, having no idea where Marcus and Peterson were hidden. Others attempted to retreat, abandoning their positions and scrambling back into the rocks. The convoy below had heard the shots and taken defensive positions. Alert now to the threat they hadn't known was waiting. Within 90 seconds of Marcus's first shot, the ambush was completely broken, the enemy fighters either down or fleeing. The immediate danger to the convoy eliminated. Marcus and Peterson remained in position, scanning for any additional threats, their hearts pounding with adrenaline even as their hands remained steady and professional. The radio crackled with reports from the convoy commander, confirming they were secure and requesting information about the sniper support they hadn't known was in place. Peterson responded with calm efficiency, providing their position and the location of the neutralized threat. In the distance, smoke rose from where Sergeant Hayes and his spotter had engaged another enemy position on the opposite side of the valley, part of the coordinated operation that had saved the convoy from a devastating attack. The extraction came hours later, after confirming no additional threats remained in the area. As Marcus and Peterson made their way down from their hide site, every muscle in Marcus's body ached from the extended time in position. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. The realization of what he had done settling in now that the immediate danger had passed. He had taken lives, ended futures, made decisions that couldn't be unmade. The training had prepared him for the technical aspects, but nothing could truly prepare someone for the emotional reality of combat. Back at the forward operating base, the company commander personally thanked Marcus and Peterson for their work. Intelligence reports confirmed that the enemy fighters they had engaged were part of a cell responsible for multiple successful attacks on coalition forces. The convoy they had protected was carrying critical medical supplies and ammunition that would have been devastating to lose. By any measure, the mission had been a complete success. But as Marcus sat in his bunk that night, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision, success felt more complicated than he had imagined. Sergeant Hayes found him in the armory later that evening, both men working on their weapons in comfortable silence for a while before the older man spoke. Hayes didn't offer platitudes or tell Marcus that it would get easier with time. Instead, he talked about the responsibility they carried, the understanding that their actions saved lives even as they took them. Every shot Marcus made had protected the soldiers in that convoy, men and women who would go home to their families because Marcus had done his job under extreme pressure. That was the reality of their role, and it was something each sniper had to make peace with in their own way. The days that followed brought more missions. More time spent in cold positions watching and waiting. Marcus's reputation grew within the unit as word spread about the long-range shots he had made during that first engagement. But he noticed something interesting happening. The other soldiers didn't treat him like a celebrity or a hero. Instead, they showed the quiet respect reserved for professionals who had proven themselves when it mattered. He was no longer the youngest kid in the company, trying to prove his worth. He was a designated marksman who had performed his role under combat conditions. And that changed everything. Peterson became more than just a spotter during those weeks. He became a friend and mentor. Someone who understood the unique pressures of their role and could share the burden of difficult decisions. They developed the kind of partnership that couldn't be taught. A wordless communication that made them more effective as a team than either could be alone. Peterson's experience balanced Marcus's raw skill, and together, they became one of the most effective sniper teams in the battalion. During a rare quiet evening at the base, Marcus finally had a chance to call home. The satellite connection was poor, cutting in and out, but he managed to speak with his grandfather for a few precious minutes. The old man didn't ask for details about combat, didn't need to hear war stories. Instead, he simply told Marcus that he was proud, that the skills he had taught his grandson were being used for the right reasons. That brief conversation meant more to Marcus than any medal or commendation possibly could. It reminded him that behind all the military training and tactical operations, he was still the kid from Montana who had learned to shoot in the mountains. Hunting elk with his grandfather and learning that taking a life, even in animals, was a responsibility that should never be taken lightly. The deployment continued through harsh weather and challenging conditions. But Marcus found himself settling into the rhythm of military life in a combat zone. The fear never completely disappeared, but it became manageable. Transformed into heightened awareness rather than paralyzing anxiety. He learned to trust his training and his instincts. To make decisions quickly when necessary, but never rush when patience was possible. Most importantly, he learned that being a good marksman wasn't just about technical skill with a rifle. It was about judgment, about knowing when to take the shot and when to wait. About understanding that every action had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. 3 months into the deployment, intelligence reported a high-value target operating in the region, insurgent commander responsible for coordinating attacks across multiple provinces. This wasn't just another fighter or cell leader. This was someone whose removal would significantly disrupt enemy operations and potentially save dozens or even hundreds of coalition lives. The mission briefing was conducted at the highest level of security, with only essential personnel present. When Sergeant Hayes volunteered his team for the operation, he specifically requested Marcus and Peterson as backup, a testament to the confidence he had. Developed in the young marksman's abilities, the operation was planned with meticulous detail that went far beyond their previous missions. The target had survived multiple assassination attempts, making him paranoid and unpredictable in his movements. Intelligence had tracked him to a remote compound in the mountains. It's a location that could only be approached on foot through extremely difficult terrain. The plan called for multiple sniper teams to establish positions around the compound, creating overlapping fields of fire that would ensure the target couldn't escape. But there was a complication that made this mission especially challenging. The compound sat in a deep valley, with the only viable shooting positions being on ridges nearly 2,000 meters away. 2,000 meters was beyond the normal engagement range for their rifles. At that distance, a bullet would drop over 40 feet from its initial trajectory. And even minor errors in wind calculation could cause misses measured in yards rather than inches. Most military snipers considered anything beyond 1,500 meters to be extremely difficult. Attempting precise shots at 2,000 meters was entering territory that separated exceptional marksmen from everyone else. During the briefing, several experienced snipers expressed doubt that hits could be achieved at such range. Even under ideal conditions, the mountain environment would make things even harder. With unpredictable wind patterns and extreme elevation changes, affecting bullet performance in complex ways, Marcus said nothing during the briefing. but his mind was already working through the challenges. He had read about shots at this distance, studied the ballistics and environmental factors that came into play at extreme range. Theoretically, it was possible. His rifle was capable of accuracy at 2,000 meters, if everything was perfect. The question was whether Marcus could be perfect when it mattered most. Sergeant Hayes caught his eye across the briefing room, a silent question passing between them. Marcus nodded slightly, an acknowledgement that he understood what was being asked and was willing to try. The insertion took 2 days of hard movement through mountains that seemed designed to break human spirits. They moved only at night, resting during the day in hide sites that were barely adequate to keep them concealed. The packs on their backs carried everything they would need for a week-long operation, including extra ammunition, survival gear, and communication equipment. Peterson navigated while Marcus focused on conserving energy, knowing that exhaustion would affect his shooting performance when the moment came. They saw no enemy forces during the approach, but the knowledge that they were moving deep into hostile territory kept everyone alert and cautious. Their assigned position was a rocky outcrop that provided a view of the compound. Below, while offering decent concealment from observation, Marcus and Peterson spent hours preparing the position, clearing tiny rocks that might shift under them, creating a stable platform for the rifle, and mapping out multiple routes for emergency extraction if things went wrong. They used range-finding equipment to measure the exact distance to various points in the compound below, confirming what they already knew. The main building where the target was expected to appear sat 2,040 meters from their position, a distance that seemed impossible when stated so plainly. The other sniper teams checked in via encrypted radio, confirming they were in position and ready. Sergeant Hayes and his spotter had taken a position on the opposite ridge, creating a crossfire that would cover multiple escape routes from the compound. The original plan had been for Hayes to take the primary shot, with Marcus and the other teams providing backup if needed. But a problem emerged when Hayes reported that his position had a partially obstructed view. Due to terrain features that hadn't been visible in the reconnaissance photos, Marcus's position had the clearest line of sight to where intelligence expected the target to appear. Without discussion, the decision was made. Marcus would take the primary shot when the opportunity presented itself. The wait began. And with it came a different kind of pressure than Marcus had experienced before. Previous engagements had happened quickly, with limited time to think about consequences or doubt his abilities. Now he had hours stretching into days to contemplate the shot ahead, to imagine all the ways it could go wrong, to feel the weight of knowing that mission success depended largely on his performance. Peterson tried to keep him focused on concrete details, running through environmental calculations and equipment checks, but the psychological burden was impossible to completely ignore. 2 days passed with no sign of the target. Intelligence updates came through periodically, confirming that the high-value individual was still expected to appear at the compound, but the waiting was agonizing. Marcus and Peterson took turns on watch, ate cold rations, and endured the physical discomfort of remaining essentially motionless for extended periods. The mountain weather turned harsh, with strong winds and occasional rain that would make any shot exponentially more difficult. Marcus found himself hoping the target would appear during one of the brief windows of calm weather. Knowing that attempting a 2,000-meter shot in high wind would border on impossible, on the third morning, just after dawn, movement appeared at the compound. Multiple vehicles arrived and figures emerged who matched the profile of the target's security detail. Peterson alerted the other teams, while Marcus settled behind his rifle, his heart rate already starting to climb despite his efforts to remain calm. Through the powerful optics, he could see armed guards taking positions around the compound perimeter, their presence confirming that someone important was arriving. The sky was clear, and the wind had died down to manageable levels. If the target was going to appear, now would be the moment. Minutes felt like hours as they watched the compound entrance. Then a figure emerged that matched the intelligence photos perfectly. The target stepped out into the open courtyard. Speaking with his security personnel, seemingly confident in the isolation of his location, he had no reason to believe that anyone could threaten him from the surrounding ridges. The distance was too great, the shot too difficult. His arrogance would be his downfall. Peterson began feeding Marcus data in a calm, steady voice. Wind speed at their position was 4 miles per hour from the northwest, but based on dust patterns in the valley below, stronger gusts were moving through the space between them and the target. Temperature was rising as the sun climbed, affecting air density. The upward angle from their position to the target added another layer of complexity to the trajectory calculations. Marcus absorbed every piece of information, his mind processing variables that most people couldn't even comprehend, translating raw data into the subtle adjustments that would determine success or failure. He made his calculations and dialed the corrections into his scope, each click of adjustment representing a fraction of an angle that would be magnified over 2,000 meters into feet of difference at the target. His breathing slowed naturally, his body entering that state of perfect calm that he had learned to achieve under pressure. Through the scope, the target looked impossibly small, a figure that seemed to shimmer in the morning heat haze rising from the valley floor. Marcus knew he would have only one chance. At this distance, the sound of the shot would take nearly 6 seconds to reach the compound, but the target's security would react immediately to any miss, hustling him inside where he might not emerge again for days or weeks. The moment stretched out, becoming almost dreamlike in its intensity. Marcus felt disconnected from his body, as if he were observing himself from a distance. His finger rested on the trigger with the lightest possible pressure, waiting for the perfect convergence of breath, heartbeat, and stability. The target paused in his conversation, turning slightly, presenting a clear profile. Peterson whispered a final confirmation of conditions, and Marcus knew the moment had arrived. Every hour of training, every shot he had ever taken, every lesson his grandfather had taught him on those Montana mountains, all of it had been preparation for this single instant. The trigger broke cleanly, the rifle recoiling against his shoulder in a familiar rhythm. Through the scope, Marcus watched the bullet's path, though of course the bullet itself was invisible at such speed and distance. He was watching for impact, for any sign that his calculations had been correct. The seconds stretched out impossibly long. At 2,000 meters, the bullet would take nearly 3 seconds to arrive. Traveling at speeds that dropped significantly over such distance, affected by gravity and air resistance in ways that pushed the limits of predictability, then the target dropped, crumpling to the ground as if his strings had been cut. The security personnel around him scattered in confusion, some dropping to defensive positions, while others rushed to their fallen commander. Through the scope, Marcus could see the chaos unfolding, but more importantly, he could see that the shot had been true, at a distance that many would have called impossible, with conditions that were far from ideal. He had delivered a precise hit on a target that could barely be seen with the naked eye. It was a shot that would be talked about for years to come. The kind of achievement that separated good marksmen from legendary ones. Peterson was already on the radio, confirming the hit to command while simultaneously preparing for their extraction. Standard procedure after such a shot was to leave the position immediately. As enemy forces would attempt to locate where the fire had come from, Marcus worked mechanically, breaking down his shooting position and packing his gear with practiced efficiency. His hands were steady, his movements calm and professional. But inside he felt a complex mixture of emotions that he couldn't fully process in the moment. Pride at accomplishing something so difficult, certainly, but also the heavy awareness of what that achievement meant in human terms. The extraction was executed flawlessly, all sniper teams moving to predetermined rally points and then being picked up by helicopters that swooped in low over the mountains. As the helicopter gained altitude, Marcus looked back at the valley where the compound sat, now crawling with enemy forces responding too late to prevent what had already happened. Sergeant Hayes sat across from him in the helicopter, and even over the noise of the rotors, Marcus could see the approval in the older man's eyes. Words weren't necessary. Hayes understood better than anyone what Marcus had just accomplished and what it had cost him to do it. Back at the forward operating base, the mission was deemed a complete success. Intelligence confirmed that the high-value target had been eliminated, and the impact on enemy operations was immediate and significant. The battalion commander personally congratulated Marcus, mentioning that the shot would likely be studied in sniper schools for years. As an example of what was possible at extreme range under difficult conditions, Marcus accepted the praise with quiet professionalism, but he felt oddly detached from the celebration around him. He had proven that he could make the impossible shot when everything depended on it, but the victory felt hollow in ways he struggled to articulate. That night, sitting alone in the darkness outside his quarters, Marcus thought about the path that had brought him to this moment. From a ranch in Montana to a forward operating base in a war zone, from a kid who struggled through basic training to a marksman capable of shots that defied probability, he had earned the respect of his unit, proven his worth under the most demanding circumstances imaginable, and accomplished things that would have seemed like fantasy just a year earlier. But he also carried the weight of the lives he had taken, the knowledge that his skill with a rifle had become a tool for ending human existence. Even when those humans were enemies threatening his fellow soldiers, Peterson found him eventually, sitting down without asking permission or offering empty comfort. They sat together in silence for a while, as professionals who understood what the other was feeling without needing to discuss it. Finally, Peterson spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. He talked about how every soldier had to find their own way to live with what war demanded of them, how the important thing was to remember why they did what they did. Marcus listened, grateful for the companionship, even if the words couldn't fully ease the burden he felt. The remaining months of the deployment passed with Marcus firmly established as one of the most capable marksmen in the battalion. Word of the 2,000-meter shot had spread throughout the military community, and he found himself fielding questions from other snipers who wanted to know the technical details of how he had accomplished it. Marcus shared what he could, explaining the calculations and adjustments. But he knew that the real answer was more complicated than any formula or technique. It was about thousands of hours of practice, about mental discipline developed through repetition, and about having the courage to trust yourself when doubt would be easier. More missions followed, some routine and others challenging in different ways. Marcus continued working primarily with Peterson, partnership becoming even stronger through shared experiences and mutual trust. They protected convoys, provided overwatch for infantry operations, and conducted reconnaissance missions deep in enemy territory. Each operation added to Marcus's experience and confidence, teaching him lessons that couldn't be learned in any training environment. He discovered that combat was rarely about dramatic moments or impossible shots. More often, it was about professionalism, patience, and making good decisions consistently under pressure. Sergeant Hayes took an increasingly mentoring role with Marcus. Recognizing that the young marksman had the potential to become a true expert in their field, Hayes shared knowledge accumulated over years of combat experience. Talking about the strategic aspects of sniper operations and how their work fit into larger military objectives, he emphasized the importance of judgment and restraint, explaining that knowing when not to take a shot was just as important as being able to make difficult shots when necessary. These conversations happened during quiet moments between missions, two professionals discussing their craft with the seriousness it demanded. One afternoon, Hayes told Marcus about his own early experiences as a young sniper, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons learned through painful trial and error. He talked about shots he regretted taking and shots he wished he had taken, about the fine line between confidence and arrogance, and about the responsibility that came with the power to affect outcomes from a distance. Hayes admitted that he had seen talented marksmen destroyed by their inability to process the psychological weight of their role, soldiers who became reckless or paralyzed by doubt. The key, he said, was to stay connected to your humanity while performing a role that required you to set aside normal human reluctance to take life as the deployment neared its end. Marcus found himself reflecting on how much he had changed in such a short time. The 19-year-old kid who had arrived at the forward, operating base nervous and uncertain, felt like a different person entirely. He'd been tested in ways he couldn't have imagined, pushed to limits he didn't know he possessed, and emerged with skills and experiences that would shape the rest of his life. But he also recognized that the person he had become carried burdens that would never fully go away. The faces of the men he had shot might fade with time, but they would never completely disappear from his memory. The final weeks brought a shift in enemy activity. With insurgent forces seeming to pull back and regroup, intelligence suggested that the elimination of the high-value target had disrupted their command structure more significantly than initially thought. Attacks on coalition forces decreased in frequency and coordination, allowing Delta Company to focus on transitioning their area of operations to local security forces. For the sniper teams, this meant fewer active missions and more time spent training their local counterparts, passing on knowledge that might help protect coalition interests after the American forces withdrew. Marcus discovered he enjoyed the teaching role more than he expected. Working with local soldiers who were learning sniper skills reminded him of his own journey. The progression from basic fundamentals to advanced techniques, he found satisfaction in seeing others develop their abilities. In knowing that the knowledge he shared might save lives after he was gone, it also gave him a different perspective on his own skills, forcing him to articulate things that had become instinctive and to break down complex techniques into teachable components. Peterson was already talking about what came next, whether they would re-enlist and potentially deploy again, or transition to other roles within the military. Marcus hadn't made any firm decisions, knowing that he needed time away from combat to truly understand what he wanted from his future. The military had given him purpose and identity, had transformed him from an uncertain recruit into a proven professional. But he also recognized that war took a toll that wasn't always visible, that the skills which made him effective in combat might not translate easily to peacetime life. The deployment officially ended on a gray morning when Delta Company boarded transport planes for the long journey home. As the aircraft climbed away from the forward operating base, Marcus looked down at the mountains and valleys where he had spent the last 9 months. That landscape held memories both terrible and triumphant, moments of fear and moments of pride, experiences that had fundamentally changed who he was as a person. He felt no nostalgia for the place itself, but a strange sense of connection to everything that had happened there. An understanding that this deployment would always be a defining chapter in his life story, the return to the home base felt surreal. After so long in a combat environment, everything seemed too clean, too quiet, too safe. Marcus and the other soldiers went through the standard post-deployment processing, medical evaluations and psychological screenings designed to identify anyone struggling with the transition. Marcus answered the questions honestly but carefully, knowing that admitting too much doubt or difficulty could affect his military career. The truth was that he felt fine in most ways, capable of functioning normally and maintaining professional standards. But he also knew that something had changed inside him, a shift in perspective that would take time to fully understand. His grandfather was waiting when Marcus finally made it home on leave, the old man standing on the porch of the ranch house just as he had stood countless times before. They embraced without words, and Marcus felt tears threatening for the first time since the deployment began. His grandfather held him tight, and in that moment, Marcus felt like he could finally let down the walls he had built to survive combat. They walked the familiar trails through the Montana mountains, and Marcus found himself talking about things he hadn't been able to discuss with anyone else, pouring out experiences and emotions that he had kept carefully controlled for months. His grandfather listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just being present as Marcus worked through his thoughts. The old man understood in ways that most people couldn't, having carried his own weight from his own war many decades earlier. He told Marcus that the hardest part wasn't the memories of what you had done, but learning to live with the person you had become. War changed everyone it touched, and denying that change was worse than accepting it and finding ways to move forward. The question wasn't whether Marcus could go back to who he was before, because that was impossible. The question was who he wanted to be now. With the experiences and scars he carried, they spent a week together on the ranch. Falling back into familiar rhythms of early mornings and physical work, Marcus found comfort in the routine, in the simple reality of fixing fences and tending to animals. Tasks that demanded attention, but not the life-or-death focus of combat operations. His body began to relax in ways it hadn't since deployment began. sleep gradually improving as the hypervigilance of war slowly faded. His grandfather never pushed him to make decisions about his future. Understanding that some questions required time and space to answer properly, one evening, sitting on the porch and watching the sun set over the mountains, Marcus's grandfather asked him a simple question. Did he still love shooting, or had the war taken that away from him? Marcus thought about it carefully before answering. He realized that his relationship with marksmanship had evolved into something more complex than simple enjoyment. The skill that had once been about hunting and competition had become tied up with responsibility and consequence. But underneath all that weight, he could still feel the fundamental satisfaction of precision, the meditative quality of perfect focus, the connection between shooter and target that transcended the context of war. Yes, he still loved it, but that love had grown up in ways that reflected his own growth. His grandfather nodded, understanding more than Marcus had actually said. The old man suggested that perhaps the path forward wasn't about choosing between military service or civilian life, about finding ways to use his skills that aligned with who he had become. Competitive shooting, law enforcement, private security, training others, even consulting work with military contractors. There were numerous paths that could honor both his abilities and his experiences. Without requiring him to keep deploying to combat zones, the key was giving himself permission to evolve, to acknowledge that the trajectory he had been on might need adjustment based on what he had learned about himself. Marcus returned to his unit with a clearer sense of purpose, if not yet a complete plan for his future. He threw himself into training rotations and continuing education opportunities, expanding his knowledge beyond pure marksmanship into broader tactical and strategic thinking. He started working toward instructor certifications, thinking that teaching might offer a way to contribute meaningfully while processing his own experiences. Sergeant Hayes encouraged this direction, pointing out that good instructors who had actual combat experience were invaluable for preparing the next generation of soldiers. The months following deployment brought a steady stream of recognition for Marcus's achievements. He received medals and commendations, formal acknowledgement of his performance under fire, and the impact his actions had on mission success. He accepted these honors with quiet pride, understanding their significance, while also recognizing that no medal could fully capture the complexity of what he had experienced. The real validation came from his peers, from the respect shown by other snipers, and the trust placed in him by commanders who knew his capabilities. As the one-year anniversary of that first deployment approached, Marcus found himself in an unexpected place. He was being asked to help develop new training protocols for designated marksmen, using lessons learned from recent combat operations to improve how the military prepared its sharpshooters. It was an opportunity to influence the system from within, to potentially help future soldiers avoid mistakes and maximize their effectiveness. The work was challenging in different ways than combat, requiring patience and attention to detail, but Marcus discovered he had aptitude for it. Looking back on his journey from uncertain recruit to respected marksman to instructor and developer of training systems, Marcus recognized how far he had traveled in such a short time. The shot that everyone had doubted, that 2,000-meter precision strike under extreme conditions, had proven something important. Not just that he had the technical skill to accomplish difficult things, but that he had the mental strength to perform when everything mattered most. That confidence had carried him through challenges he never anticipated and would continue to guide him wherever his path led next. The unit's youngest sharpshooter had become something more than just a skilled marksman. He had become a professional who understood the weight of his abilities, a teacher who could pass on hard-won knowledge, and a veteran who carried his experiences with dignity and purpose. The doubts others had expressed about him early on seemed distant now, replaced by a reputation built on actual accomplishment under the harshest possible evaluation. Marcus had proven what he was capable of, and in doing so, had discovered reserves of strength and character he hadn't known he possessed. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination and precision that had defined his most challenging moments, ready to make the shots that needed taking, whether they were measured in meters or in the quieter distances of a life lived with purpose and integrity.